we do have experts in the room, all of you and these esteemed panelists. And so if I may invite your attention back to the front of the room, we hope that you had interesting perspective, putting yourself in the shoes of Albertine and Blaise of Rwanda, Hakima and Kenya of the United States, and Juana Carolina and Maria Sofia of Colombia. These young men and women have much more to share, and therefore we have uploaded additional context in the form of videos onto the SOCAP app, and so we invite you to take a look at that later. But to get started with our conversation, I would like to have you get to know our panelists. And rather than me try to do justice to the work and the experience that each of them bring, I thought we would share firsthand. And so Felipe, then Batya, then Kevin, and Kira, I'd like to start out by inviting each of you to share what personal experiences or insights first inspired you to tackle the challenge of making higher education more accessible and equitable. So Felipe, may we begin with you?
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you everyone for being here. I was born in Colombia, and when I was very young, I lived in a relatively affluent family. But when I was 10 years old, many things changed and the family went bankrupt. There were some issues with my parents. And then I went to live for a year in a village without studying. And when I came back to Bogota, the capital of the country, I spent about 6 years, my teenage years, in a kind of low-income neighborhood in a very different situation where many kids didn't finish high school, were in gangs. So it was a very different reality from the one I knew when I was very, very young. And then when I finished my high school, I could go to university. And then things changed a lot. I graduated as an engineer. I went to work in investment banking, then came to the US to do an MBA, worked at McKinsey. But I never forgot my 6 or 7 years in a very different context. So at some point, I just felt kind of a deep willingness to connect the two worlds that I had experienced. And this is what I have been doing for the last 23 years.
Wonderful, thanks for sharing that with us. Batya, how about you?
So my story also goes back to my sort of early 20s. I'm from South Africa, Johannesburg, and from a single parent household with 5 siblings, and I didn't go to university. It wasn't an option for me. Bank loans are very, very expensive generally on the African continent, and governments have a little bit of money for education financing, but it's quite limited. I ended up working in a call center in Germany. I was very fortunate. But at the age of 27, I felt like I could do more. I wanted more. And so I applied to a university, a private university, because I didn't get into the public ones in Germany. And I knew that they had some sort of financing scheme. The most important thing that I knew is that I didn't have to pay interest or collateral whilst I was studying. And I'll never forget the moment where I signed an income share agreement. And I just thought, wow, this must be a really good education institution because they believe that I'm going to get a good job and then repay once I actually have a good job. And that is the beginning of my journey with income share agreements. I worked for the organization that financed me, and that took me to Rwanda one day where I met Arlette. And Arlette's story is even more poignant, I think, for me because she comes from a subsistence farming household. She was the first in her family to finish high school. And she couldn't go to university either. She scraped together a bit of money for her first semester and then dropped out and went to work back on her parents' subsistence farm. And so that's when I learned that only 91% of young African youth are stuck in poverty because they can't make that step into getting into education that leads into employment.
Thank you, Batya. How about you, Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin James. I'm the founder of Better Future Forward, and I came to this as a young staffer on Capitol Hill. I was in my late 20s and had the pleasure of working for Congressman Tom Petri. He's retired now, and he had been passionate about fixing student loans long before anyone was ever talking about this. I found an old typewritten FAQ document from the early 80s in his office. And through him, he was very interested in income-based student loans, a sort of similar principle as ISAs, and he worked for decades to try and get a good, simple system in the US. And in Australia and New Zealand, they did very simple systems, and in the US, we decided to go in a different direction and create the most complicated system ever devised by humanity. And so in 2007, enter me as a young staffer, and he says, I want you to make this system simple and make it look like those other countries. And so I have kind of an obsessive personality. My wife reframes it as tenacity, but I just went after it. I wanted to make a difference, and I talked to everyone who would talk to me on the Hill, think tanks, researchers, advocates, to try and learn about this idea. It was like pulling on a string. Like, why are we not doing this? And so we pushed and pushed and pushed, and we did legislation, and I think we changed a lot of minds. But somewhere around 2014, it became clear it's just so hard to change the big federal system. There was just, I think, some really big structural dynamics around. It's hard for Congress to think about quality of institutions. It's hard. It's a very top-down system. There's no engagement with students. And it's big. There's 42 million people who have federal student loans. More people have federal student loans than have Social Security or receive Social Security. And so it's just a very hard system to change. And so that led me to realize there's an opportunity here to found an organization and work with others to build sort of a better system from the ground up. And that was 10 years ago, and you look at the system today, and it's still in a very precarious state, and the opportunity to make big changes is very clear.
Thank you for your tenacity, and you've invited us all to be on this journey with you. Kira, help us understand your origin in this work.
Hi everyone, Kira Gidron, CEO of Lumni. First of all, I'm amazed by all of your stories. I actually fell into this work and fell in love with this work. And I think there are 3 reasons. One, because so I'm originally Spanish, studied and worked in the US, and now for the past 6 years have been living in Colombia, in Bogota, and have seen with this work with education and employment pathways just how transformational it can be, but also how empowering ISAs can be, not just because of the funding, but because you're telling the student, I believe in you, and therefore I will fund you. We have one student, some of you may have gotten that card, that studied creative writing, and she applied to a lot of bank loans, the federal student loan system, but no one wanted to invest in creative writing, because what do you do with that after? So today, Lumni invested in her, and for her that was transformational precisely because somebody finally believed in her and believed in her vocation. The second reason is of how difficult it is to identify your vocation and your life's purpose. I always give the example of myself and my sister. My sister's a special ed teacher, and she wants to be a special ed teacher since she's like 10. Just identified her vocation very early. I studied mechanical engineering, made a mistake, like that was not my path, but everyone finally sort of finds their way. And then I think finally it's also the challenge of how do we mobilize more. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but how at seemingly opposing odds or ends, education and capital and mobilizing private sector capital are. And I think the challenge of that is super interesting.
Thank you all for sharing how you've come to this work. What we'd like to learn now is more about the organizations in which you are leading. And to do that, we want to remember the youth in all of us. So we're going to use the format of Mad Lib. For those of you that have forgotten what Mad Lib is, this is a fill-in-the-blank approach. So I'm going to offer the prompt and then invite you to fill in the blanks. The prompt is as follows. Your organization developed a defined offering to help a defined audience solve a specific problem. This matters because, explain why it matters. By 2035, we hope to be on a path to what is your big bet in the next 10 years? Let's hear from Batya, then Kevin, then Felipe. So Batya, over to you.
Chancen International. Oh, I need a microphone.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm nervous, but yeah. I'm much better at storytelling than Mad Lib, so let's give this a shot. Chancen International developed fair and ethical income share agreements for the lowest household income young people on the African continent. We aim to be the Grameen Bank and set the standard of the best ethical financial student support in Africa. And by 2035, we would have attracted more players into the market on the African continent and reached 100,000 young people.
Thank you. Kevin?
I founded Better Future Forward. We're a nonprofit social enterprise, and we build ISA programs currently in the Midwest, in Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Milwaukee. And we are currently serving low-income students, underserved populations like dreamers who are pursuing a college degree. This matters because education after high school is central to living any kind of fulfilling and prosperous life, and millions of Americans are shut out from that currently. By 2035, we ultimately aim to be able to support every young person, working adult, who needs this type of support, not just with college, but across a range of educational pathways, from apprenticeships to workforce. Whatever you can dream of in terms of ways to invest in people. And so we aim to both be on that journey and, as Batya said, to work with these great organizations to build a field of fair and ethical providers.
In 2001, I co-founded Lumni. That year, we funded 4 students. Since then, we have funded 25,000 students in 12 countries, in Latin America mostly, and some students in the US. And we have mobilized $100 million and also delivered impact returns to investors. Our goal for the future is to help, to mobilize ideally $1 billion and support in the range of 200,000 new students, and also create not only a transformation in the life of the students, but also of the families who give back and invest sustainably, not only in Latin America, or in the Americas, but also globally.
Thanks for orienting us on your organization and the important work that you're leading in various regions around the world. Let's get into talking about the challenges in income share agreements and creating a fair and ethical ecosystem. We know that income share agreements have been in the spotlight recently. Some of this very positive, and also on occasions things that haven't been as positive. Some providers have been criticized for not acting in the best interest of their students, and so we want to acknowledge this. And to start, can each of you share about your approach and how you operate with strong consumer protections in place? Kevin, we'll begin with you, and then Batya and Felipe with Kira.
I think for us, it started with a recognition that an ISA is a tool, and it has very promising features that enable incredibly impactful programs. But at the end of the day, it's a tool, and you can do malicious things with it, and oftentimes you can just do careless things with it if you're not thoughtful and purposeful in how you use it. And so we've done 3 things in our work that I think has helped to make sure that we're building these in student-friendly ways. One is really think through what is it that success looks like. It's not originating ISAs. It's thinking about, from the student's experience, what do we want to be true? We're trying to get capital to people who need it in a way that helps them succeed in their education, succeed in their career, that they have a payment obligation, but it's affordable, it's humane, it's fair. You could talk to them, they would say, this is working for me, I don't have anxiety. And lastly, that it's financially sustainable, that all of that is creating a cycle that can support future students. So that was part one, was defining success clearly. Part two was just measuring that, making sure that we're actually living up to that, getting very proximate to our students. We just launched our first student advisory board. We do surveys of our students to understand their experience. And three is to listen to critics, that there's been a lot of criticism of the space, some of it unfair, but other times critics are seeing real things. And each time people raise things, it's on us to pull out what is true about what they're saying and incorporate it into our work.
So to recap, Kevin, I heard you say that ISAs are a tool with features. It's important to define success for the user, and we need to get proximate and listen to our critics. Batya, how about you? What is your perspective?
So I'm going to take a small step back here because lots of new faces in the room, and thank you for coming all the way up here. I'm also conscious of the fact that sometimes when we work in this space, we just assume everybody understands what an ISA is. So I'm going to answer this backwards and say, imagine a world where in the same way where we're investing in companies where we see high potential and success in the future, we're doing that in young people, right? And the best way to do that is to really understand what is happening in the labor market, where are the jobs going to be, what does the future of work look like, and make sure that you're mapping pathways for young people like that. And that is one of the best ways to keep a financial product fair and ethical, because what you're saying is that the cost of education, what you're paying for your education, needs to align with your future income. So you have real return on investment. And the cool thing about an ISA is that ties it together, right? We're saying pay back 10% of your net income for 5 years if you're studying to be a hospitality manager, because we know that you are going to have a job in the hospitality sector that is going to have X amount of income. And I think as long as you think about pathways for young people in this way, it's almost impossible not to keep it fair and ethical.
Thanks for helping us have that context and starting with the end. Felipe, Kira, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Sarah. Using the ISA, we've been focused also on some key outcomes. One of them is to make sure that students graduate from college, and we've had an 80% graduation rate. Just to give some context, for low-income students, especially in Latin America, average graduation rates are in the range of 40%, so we've been able to double average graduation rate. Then employability, formal employability. We have about 75% of formal employability. 3 out of 4 young people that we support and having a formal job in a region where youth unemployment is extremely high, and only about 15 to 20% of young people start with a formal job. And also for those students who do extremely well, we cap how much they pay back. So it's been very fair and flexible for them, but we're very proud or happy that we've been able to do this in a way that we have been delivering positive financial returns to investors, and also Lumni has been sustainable. Actually, we lost money for many years, but in the last 4 years we've been sustainable. So we feel grateful that this is happening after so many years.
I love all the different perspective. Kira, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I can add a couple things, just echoing off of the panel. I just mentioning maybe 2 things. One, I think there's a very sort of interesting, maybe tricky balance in working with the students, in making sure expectations are very clear in how we're going to support them, but also in what their responsibilities are. It's sort of like being maybe a hardline mother, where you want to be caring and the tone needs to be caring, but you also need to not be too lax, because they also need to put in effort in terms of finding a job and so on. So that's a very sort of interesting balance to play. And building off of what Kevin was saying in terms of, it's super important to put the student at the center and always innovate and continuously innovate around their needs. So this year, for example, we launched a variation of the product based on what we were hearing from students, where they were very concerned around how much they were ultimately going to pay, because ISA terms are usually, you'll pay 15% or 10% of your salary during X number of months. And the question is always, well, how much am I going to pay? So we switched the product a little bit to put, to say you're going to pay 10% of your salary until you pay X amount, however long that may take you. We're also thinking of a variation on the product for postgraduate students that in many cases have the ability to pay from the beginning because they're also working. So just always putting the student at the center, listening to them and thinking about how to continuously improve and cater the product to their needs.
Thank you for that. I want to keep this conversation going and talk a little bit more about the consumer protections. With that in mind, what do you think it's going to take to scale more fair and ethical providers in the income share agreement space? Are there any specific policy frameworks, industry standards, or partnerships that you think could be instrumental in this being a commonly known, used, and accepted approach? Who'd like to start?
I can kick us off. So when we launched in Rwanda in 2018, and we basically set ourselves up as a little financial institution. We recognized that the private sector needs to solve this problem, and then we're just going to do it, and people will watch and learn. And what happened is the government of Rwanda was very curious about what we were doing, because we were reaching young people that they were not able to reach. They don't have enough of a fiscal budget to finance all the students that need financing, and banks are not interested in creating products for this space. And so we had the government come to us and be like, this is very interesting, it's really working, young people are engaged, they're paying back. We had banks starting to ask us questions. They're like, well, maybe we can do the same, but maybe we can overcharge students, or maybe we can have higher interest rates. And I was like, hold on, we need to get policy into place pretty quickly to make sure that this is protecting young students. And so consumer protection is incredibly important for income share agreements, especially when you look at when do you start paying? So what is the minimum income threshold and what is the maximum you repay? And so we're working with the government of Rwanda and Kenya on policy around that. But what's more important for that is a supportive market system to support that. And that is actually why we're here today, because we founded the Global ISA Alliance, which is a global platform that helps all of us talk to each other, so that when we are doing policy work and trying to do systems change, that we actually can leverage off shared knowledge, but also show governments locally this is not just an exotic case, there's an actual alliance.
Kevin, how about you?
I would echo a lot, I'd echo a lot of what Batya was saying. In the US, as I mentioned, I founded BFF in 2017, and so we've watched countless ISA programs come into be in the last 7 to 8 years. And as Sarah mentioned, there's both really promising work where we've seen tremendous outcomes. I mean, we have, in our work, our typical student is graduating with an 81% graduation rate compared to roughly 50% nationally. And so we've seen the impact, but we've also seen the ways in which it can go wrong. And so we've led efforts in the US to really put in place standards for these programs and make sure providers are doing them well. And I felt blessed to meet Batya and get connected with this community so that we could collaborate internationally. I think there's opportunities to then translate some of that into policy to create real, strong regulatory frameworks as well. And that's sort of a next level jump that we've been working on as well.
Thank you. I think the most important thing that a community can do or a country can do is to invest in the human capital of its young people. It's what has a more long-term impact. However, in many countries, the financial systems and the investment systems are very short-term oriented. So what we have been trying to do is to change the minds and bring more and more people to invest long-term and to show that this works. And one of the dreams that we have is that pension funds and insurance companies and those huge assets that exist in most economies could be invested in what makes more sense to, which is to develop the young people. But it takes a lot of time to convince them. So I think what is crucial in this moment is to have more catalytic capital to continue proving that those solutions work, so that we can increase the momentum, so that the countries shift towards more long-term investment in its future, in its young people.
Okay, so it was very important to all of us to acknowledge what is important in building this ecosystem, but I'd like to shift the conversation now to balancing financial sustainability and student-centric models. Another aspect of getting ISAs right is ensuring financial stability while being student-friendly. So I'm going to ask each of you to share with us, what are you doing differently in this area, and how are you striking a balance between offering, Kira, what you were acknowledging as a supportive and also equitable model for students while maintaining a financially viable program, because that is instrumental to all of us achieving this dream of this approach being commonly accepted and investable for big asset pools. I'd like to start with Kevin first, then Felipe, and Batya, you afterward.
Thanks, Sarah. It's an interesting question because it always, it's natural to think that there is this financial tension between building programs well and financial sustainability. And in fact, when I got into this, I described what we were trying to build, a program that's accessible, doesn't have a cosign or a credit score, and it's income-based. People don't have an obligation until they earn a certain amount, and that our focus would be underserved populations. And a lot of times people would say, well, that's always going to be philanthropically dependent. Like, you can't make it work with low-income students and have it be financially sustainable. And it really bothered me when they would say that, because I think what they're seeing is that the current system doesn't work well for students and their outcomes aren't good, and they're extrapolating. But what we would try and say is that this model is different, that this is about setting them up for success and making sure that they have the things that they need, because the outcomes right now are a product of the barriers and the lack of tools that they have. We can give them those things, we can set them up for success, and that is good for them and it's good for the program, and that's exactly what we've seen through our work.
I would like to ask Kira to answer this question. I just want to mention something very briefly. I am the founder of Lumni, and I have been I was the CEO for 22 years until last year, and I thought that I was the most frugal person on earth, but then Kira came, and she can answer this question better than me.
Thank you. First, I wanted to start off by mentioning I don't think financially sustainable and equitable for the students are opposing ideas. And just, I think the best example of that is if you try to optimize for the returns of the investors and therefore need to make the product for the students very onerous or very harsh, you're not going to be able to get students to buy into the product. Therefore, you won't be able to allocate the capital that you just raised, and therefore won't meet your fiduciary responsibility to the investors. So that balance is totally necessary. And I think some ways you get to that balance is first finding good programs with good outcomes. A lot of what we do, similar to VCs or impact investors that look for the best companies out there, we look not just for the best talent, but also for the best programs that have good graduation, employment, and salary outcomes. The second thing is also aligning everyone, and that's a lot of what ISAs do, is change the game around aligning incentives so that students, investors, education providers, and the ISA providers are all aligned to the student's success in terms of graduation and employment. So it's also asking or setting up models with the education providers such that you're paying part of their cost of tuition aligned to graduation and employment outcomes. And in the same way, at Lumni, we get paid as well for graduation employment outcomes and also based on student repayments. So aligning everyone is super important. And then finally, I'll echo something Felipe said earlier. I think it's also really important to bring catalytic capital into the equation. in order to unlock private sector capital with perhaps slightly better returns. Lumni in the funds, we've been doing funds for 20 years, or Felipe has been leading funds for 20 years. In the last 10 years, we've seen an average internal rate of return between 6 to 8%, whether that's in local currency or we have a couple funds in US dollars, which we think is a great IRR, especially if you compare it to other asset classes. But we need investors coming into this world of education to align their expectations with this world and knowing that education is a very patient investment.
Batya, how about you?
So I was really lucky. The provider that gave me my income share agreement, in that same year, they launched the first retail bond for ISAs in Germany, and it sold out within 24 hours. And so that's been my North Star from the beginning. If you can raise money for this kind of investment with retail bonds, so what is the pathway to getting there? And so when we launched in Rwanda and we're now active in South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana, I mapped that backwards. And that's actually what brought me to this kind of space, right? How do we use catalytic capital, philanthropic dollars, impact investing? But for us, it's how do we use that to get us on the pathway to actually being commercially viable and eventually raising money locally with bonds. And so the first step we took was to raise a blended fund using philanthropic dollars from the UBS Optimus Foundation, but then also starting to bring in development finance institutions like the DFC. And we are in that way starting to prove that even in a place like Rwanda, when you're lending to the riskiest group on the continent, with a 95% repayment rate, people are in good standing. We're showing youth are investable, right? We only have 4% that are defaulting. That is almost better than some microfinance institutions. And so it's really about just proving out the model, going through this research and development phase so that we can eventually unlock local private capital.
Thank you for that. We are surrounded by a room full of stakeholders, people who are investors and potential education partners, and we know that we're all looking for ways to make a meaningful impact. So I want to ask you, what advice would you offer about how others can help more students access and complete tertiary education and succeed in their careers by supporting income share agreements? Batya, we concluded with you, so let's start with you.
Yes. So my advice or ask is going to be help us to build the market systems that we need to really scale. And if we look at the development of new asset classes, and microfinance is a really great example, what is critical are alliance or standard type organizations. Organizations like the Global ISA Alliance that bring players like us together, that develop standards for the ethical use of the product, that have a community of practice, that are doing policy work, etc. So for many of you, I work very, very far away from here, and Africa might not be a place where you're investing. If you're investing, please talk to me. But what we need to really scale in Africa is to have this global home for ISAs. So my recommendation would be support the Global ISA Alliance.
Thank you for the recommendation. We're always open to them. Felipe, how about you?
Yes, I echo Batya's words. I think I am always amazed at what is happening. I mean, when we began doing this, everybody said this is not going to work. People are not going to pay you back. How can you know how much they're going to earn? There won't be returns. But it has worked, and now it's been a lot of patient work from multiple organizations, and with incredible support from key partners such as UBS and the Optimus Foundations. Now we're at a turning point. It's really an inflection point, and we need the support of people. It's amazing. Sometimes $1 invested in an ISA can generate $100 of salaries for the person throughout life, and sustainable. And it creates a middle class. It creates so it's really a moment to invest in the future is a way to invest in democracies. Actually, in Latin America, to give an example, it's a very complex moment because a lot of countries are going more towards kind of autocracy. We need to really empower the people, and I think this is a great way to do it, and we're very optimistic that this is going to happen. I would love to have another panel here at SOCAP in a few years and say, okay, we went to a totally different level.
We will hold ourselves accountable to that. Kevin, how about your views?
I would say that speaking from our perspective, finding providers who are willing to hold themselves to high standards, the standards that Batya was describing, and then providing patient catalytic capital to really prove out these business models in the right way for scale. And the reason I say that is because I truly believe, going back to the other question, that these can combine tremendous social impact with financial sustainability, but it takes perseverance and creativity and patience to build them in the right way. So certainly, we'd love to talk, and I know others would, but finding partners who want to create that long-term impact is essential.
Thank you all for your advice. We've had many more people join the room since we started our session and invited everyone to get to know each other and take on the persona of some students with income share agreements. And I see that there is some questions in the room. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to flip the script and invite you to offer your feedback and perspective. So thinking about what you've learned today from these three providers of income share agreements, what advice or insights might you have for them? And to do that, we've placed on your chair a little card from the Global ISA Alliance seeking your reflections. So if I could invite you to take a minute or two to think through these questions, to jot down your thoughts. And once we do that for a minute, then we'd like to invite 2 or 3 of you to share your reflections or ask your questions. Thank you for helping us with this by writing down your suggestions. Thank you for your questions. So, Batya, do you mind starting? And for the benefit of everyone in the room, can you rephrase what you heard the question to be before you offer your advice?
Yes, sure. It's a great question, and it's very important, and it's around like will there be enough jobs on the African continent? And you shared a statistic that there are about a deficit of 400,000 jobs every month. Yes, and looking at it from a macroeconomic view, it is a really, really big question. But, and this is why the feasibility study that we did is so important, if you drill down into it, what is happening is that there's a massive gap between the skills that are coming out of higher education institutions and what the private sector really needs. And that is why the income share agreement, I think, is such an interesting product, because you're aligning that at the onset. So if we look at, for instance, the graduate unemployment rate in Kenya, it's very, very high because the graduates that are entering the labor market don't have skills or don't have qualifications that are needed in the labor market. And when you speak with the ministries of education, they're all about, okay, let's increase our enrollment rates by 60%. Let's push more people through the door. But no one is asking the question, what is happening on the other side? And so we're starting to show that if you plan backwards, so if you do demand-led planning, then you can change that. And then what starts to happen is the more that you are giving the private sector the skills that they need, the faster they can grow. And so then there are more jobs. Or you have like the program that you're working on, which I think my team is also engaging with you. You start setting up sort of early stage entrepreneurs. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
That was a great question. Just to paraphrase, you were asking about the cost of college, the cost of post-secondary education, and whether that's just unsustainable. And I would echo Batya's comments that part of ISAs, of course, is getting people the financial capital that they need, and it's protective and it's based on income. But the second half of all of this is the alignment around outcomes and cost. That the value proposition for ISAs at a macro level is also their ability to change the post-secondary system fundamentally to be one that's more accountable, one that's more innovative. So for example, we look at the graduation rates of the institutions that we send students to make sure that they are helping students graduate and the after-school outcomes, because it doesn't serve us, it doesn't serve the student well if they're not doing well by students. And so I think ISAs have to grow in tandem with actually driving changes to the post-secondary system itself.
And my paraphrase of the last question is, how can a foundation like the UBS Optimus Foundation help clients who are philanthropists understand that there is an important connection between early childhood and transition to employment, knowing that this happens within a decade time period? And the way that I think of this as part of the UBS Social Impact and Philanthropy team is there are many things happening at once. One is within the UBS Optimus Foundation, we have a very intentional, defined programmatic strategy where we are a convener and collaborator with partners in various regions around the world in specific portfolios. That is the work of our programmatic team. But the real UBS ecosystem is 156,000 employees. We are a small government ourselves, and we have the opportunity and the responsibility to meet clients where they are, to be more ingratiating to what they have the energy to do in order to deploy their philanthropic capital, to be patient capital, to be catalytic capital. And when they understand through practice that this opportunity is linked, then we can inspire them to be part of the continuum. Much of what we do is using the word continuum, because when you're practicing in financial services, we do not want to perpetuate the philosophy that there is delineation between investment capital and philanthropic capital. When we see that there is a convergence between the way investors in the next generation are thinking. So we meet clients where they are to inspire them to take action and to bring them on a journey that brings together their investments with solving social and environmental challenges.
I was thinking, for example, about one particular area, which is healthcare, and for example, nurses, and with the aging of the population, I mean, across the globe, and also a little bit more in particular in wealthier countries, there's going to be a huge shortage of nurses. And at the same time, in low-income countries, there is a lot of unemployment of people. So it's like on one part of the globe, you need nurses, and on some parts, the people don't find jobs. So one of the things we're doing is we're financing the education of nurses and also for them to work in their countries, but some of them want to migrate legally. So this creates a great opportunity. This reduces the cost for healthcare in countries like the US. So that's the type of cross-border investments that we're developing, and we can have that. It can have hugely positive impact across the region. We're one world. But this is just one example, but it happens in so many things, in teaching, in so many other industries. So I think I like the fact that we have to look at this as a globe, not only as local work markets.
Thank you for the question. I'll just add on to that. The couple of use cases we've seen, like the nursing example, and I'll mention another one now, actually so far we've seen that it depends on, again, on the situation. Like Malengo, for example, another member of the Global ISA Alliance, helps bring African students to study in Europe. So it depends on the use case, but in the couple that we've seen, I actually think the investment is smaller than we think to unlock a certain barrier that can lead to great outcomes. So in the case of the nurses, they, in our case in Latin America, they need to learn English, they need to get their degrees accredited in the US, and they need to pass the nursing exam in the US, which the cost of all of that, at least that portion, then there's the whole visa portion. But interestingly, hospitals and employers are willing to cover all of that, just because of the opportunity cost to be able to hire a nurse. So this other portion that we'd be covering is actually a pretty small investment relative to the salary jump they're going to have from being Latin American based nurses to US nurses. And then the other very quick example is helping Venezuelan migrants in Colombia and other Latin American countries get their degrees accredited, the degrees they got in Venezuela. Again, they already made the big investment of going to university in Venezuela. We're just funding a tiny portion to get their degree, about $1,000 to get their degrees accredited in Colombia, and that can change their lives dramatically. And raise their, go from informal to formal jobs and raise their salaries significantly. So I actually think it may be a bit counterintuitive that with a very small investment, you can really unlock the professional lives of the migrants.
We have about 2 minutes left in our formal allotted time for this conversation. Of course, we hope that we'll continue talking more about this. So, last question for everyone on the panel. In 30 seconds each, can you give us your views on best practices of how to get education providers to adopt ISAs as part of their revenue strategy? And we'll start right here.
So actually ISAs are a lifeline to the education providers that we work with. Only 9% of young people on the African continent can afford to pay for education. So really good education institutions can't grow. And it's so much of a lifeline that they pay us a partnership fee to get this additional revenue.
I think in the US, they also can be a lifeline. My sense is that because there's been more negative headlines in the US, that more are shying away from using them. And I think showing what's possible through good programs and socializing that work can really change that dramatically.
Many universities in the world now have empty seats. So one of the things is we're convincing many of them to allow underserved students to go study, pay today whatever they can, and then pay back in the future with an income sharing agreement. So that's the type of the things that can be done and can create opportunities for many. Just to give a brief example, only doing this we have unlocked close to $20 million of assets that will be future payments for the universities, but this is going to generate probably more than $1 billion in salaries for the students that are now studying and will work tomorrow.
And I think it means we play an orchestration role in raising the bar of quality across all providers to say who's willing to put money where their mouth is, who's willing to take a portion of their tuition costs and put it against graduation outcomes and employment outcomes. And it's not easy. They've never been asked to do that. But if you believe in your program, if you believe in what you're doing for students, you'd be willing to put 20, 30%, whatever it is, against those outcomes. And it takes someone orchestrating that and asking for that.